Craig Climo was Nigel Murray's predecessor as the DHB CEO. He hasn't previously spoken about Nigel Murray's behaviour and his departure. And he's awaiting the Audit Office and State Services Commission reports. But he says a CEO should be in the office and not constantly swanning around the world spending money at expensive hotels and restaurants. And he says he simply doesn't understand how that situation was allowed to continue. I asked Craig Climo, first of all, how long he was the DHB CEO for.
7 years, and for the 10 years prior to that, South Canterbury District Health Board and its predecessors.
So 17 years as a CEO of a DHB?
Yes.
And how many times did you go overseas during those 17 years?
Once, to Australia.
Once in 17 years?
But having said that, I'm at the other extreme, and there would be many people who would say that's inadequate. That's too few to be discharging the job properly. I have a different view.
And what was your view? Was your view about the money?
Partly. It was also about modelling, creating expectations. I don't think it's necessary to swan around the planet in order to pick up and adopt other people's ideas. So, as you might have picked up from what I've said already, I am a bit of an outlier in my views.
And certainly in your personal fiscal restraint. So, when we compare you as an outlier and Nigel Murray, who I think it is fair to say was an outlier at the other extreme, and he was away roughly half the time in his last year, what do you make of that?
Well, it was an abuse of his position at every level. Firstly, the expenditure, and secondly, the time away. And he needed to be on the ground. For any chief executive, it doesn't matter in what industry, I think the time on the ground is related to the issues the organisation faces. And all DHBs are facing issues. They're large, complex organisations. Waikato District Health Board employs around 6,500 people. They literally have hundreds of providers to them. So my attitude is that's where the time should be spent, not swanning around. And what's even worse is, from what I've read, and bear in mind, John, what I'm talking about with you is based on what's in the public domain.
Absolutely.
I don't have any private information around this. But a good deal of that time and expenditure seem to be about promoting an American IT vendor's product. It's bizarre.
Were you surprised when Nigel Murray got the job?
I was a little. Yes, I was a little. Yeah, I don't want to say much more.
And I don't want to push you, because you played no role whatsoever in the decision.
No.
You were the former CEO, you had gone by then, and you played no part whatsoever in appointing Nigel Murray. But could I ask you, if you don't mind, and you don't have to elaborate on why you were surprised?
Because of Nigel's reputation in New Zealand at what was Southland District Health Board at that time. Spending time over in British Columbia when he was employed at Southland as Chief Executive. And
then he got a job subsequently in British Columbia, didn't he?
He did, and I understand there was a claim that he was working there as an unpaid advisor or some such thing, but it struck myself at the time, and certainly other colleagues, as being unusual.
I've been speaking to clinicians at the Waikato DHB, and they have a very real sense that Nigel Murray was the minister's and the ministry's man there. In other words, that he was committed to bringing the DHB in on budget, that he was committed to not having deficits, that he was committed to doing whatever was required to achieve financial targets. Did you hear those sorts of descriptions of him?
No. And as you can imagine, I wasn't part of the recruitment process. But this is the first time that I've heard any suggestion that he was the minister and minister's man. Now, having said that, he was certainly the chairman man, that's for sure.
In what way?
Bob Simcock has tied, I guess, nailed his colours to the Nigel Murray cross. I saw him very much as Bob's appointment, Bob's man. And whilst the board as a whole has to accept responsibility and fairness, the chairman, particularly in these sorts of appointment processes, has a great deal of influence. The board's quite reliant, really, on the chair's advice. And there were issues. Everybody's aware of the concerns that swirled around prior to the appointment. Now, again, I imagine the investigation will look at those.
Craig, did the Waikato DHB have video conference facilities?
Yes, it does.
And were staff encouraged to use those facilities rather than travel?
Yes, they are.
And for obvious reasons, to save money, right? To improve efficiency, to have staff at work on the ground more than they are away, and to spend less.
Correct. And it's efficient. But also it's not just to replace face-to-face meetings amongst management-type people. It's also used clinically as well, and it's invaluable there. It speeds the seeing of patients. It's more convenient for patients as well. So, yeah, there certainly are video conferencing facilities. There's quite a number of them.
So once again, this brings us back to the remarkable number of days Nigel Murray was travelling.
It's gobsmacking. It really is. And out of all of this, it's the staff and the management that I feel incredibly sorry for. And providers to that organisation. And as you're aware, it's a district health board, like many, that's struggling to make ends meet. And imagine how difficult it is for the management to be out there selling to the staff and providers that they have to tighten their belts yet again. It's just bizarre. As I said at the outset, at every level, the money, the time, the incredibly poor example that it sets. But I'm just like to add, if I may, that I'm very proud of the team for raising the issues, for pursuing it. Good on them. Good on them for doing that.
You talk of your pride in the whistleblowing, effectively, by people who were below Nigel Murray in the organisation and therefore were doing so at some risk to themselves.
Correct.
What about the governance from the board? Was there enough oversight being kept on a man who had arrived with warnings against him and with assurances given that he would be watched?
Well, it appears not. I have no idea how somebody could spend half their work time absent and spend all that money without it being obvious. All expenses should be signed off, if not in advance, at least retrospectively for the more minor items. But I wouldn't expect to travel as a chief executive internationally without that being signed off in advance. Whenever I was away, and I would imagine most chief executives would work like this, even as a matter of courtesy, I would inform the chairman that I'm going to be away. And he'd been away so often, you imagine the chairman, just in the normal course of events, would have phoned or emailed or gone in to have a conversation with him and found him not there. But I don't know. As I said, I just do not know how this could have arisen.
That's Craig Climo, Nigel Murray's predecessor at the Waikato DHB.